The 50s gave us chrome, fins, and some of the dumbest cars ever built. These weren't just weird, they were mechanical disasters. Ugly, underpowered, unsafe, and sometimes completely useless. You'll laugh, you'll cringe, and you'll wonder how these even made it off the drawing board. These are the 12 stupidest garbage cars of the 1950s. And no, you haven't seen anything like them. 1. 1957 King Midget Model III. The 1957 King Midget Model III wasn't just a bad car. It was almost a parody of what a car could be. This was the kind of vehicle that made people ask, "Is this legal?" and then quickly follow up with, "Is this safe?" And designed and sold by the Midget Motors Corporation in Ohio, the King Midget was meant to be the ultimate minimalist automobile, appealing to budget-minded Americans who wanted a way to get around without the cost or hassle of a real car. But in their quest for affordability, the designers may have gone a few steps too far, or rather they skipped several steps entirely. Picture this, you ordered your King Midget by mail. That's right, you could get it delivered like a mail-order catalog item. It either arrived fully built, if you paid a bit more, or as a kit you assembled yourself in your garage or driveway. Assembly wasn't difficult, mainly because there just wasn't much car to put together. A basic steel frame, thin body panels, no doors, tiny wheels, and a one-cylinder Wisconsin engine that cranked out a ferocious 9.2 horsepower. That's not a typo. Less than 10 horses were expected to haul your full weight, plus the car's 500-pound body, up to a theoretical top speed of 50 miles per hour. And good luck reaching that without a long stretch of flat road, a push from behind, and the absence of crosswinds. Owner recollections from the era are often part amusement, part trauma. One former owner recalled, "It was like driving a lawnmower with turn signals." And that was no joke. The engine was in fact borrowed from industrial equipment, complete with a hand crank starter in some models. Acceleration? Let's just say that a school bus full of kids had a better chance of winning a drag race. And while you might think, well, at least it was cheap, remember that being cheap doesn't excuse being terrifying. The brakes were questionable at best, the handling felt like a shopping cart on ice, and the open-sided body meant any accident, even a bump, could send you flying. And then there was the safety, or rather, the complete absence of it. There were no crumple zones, no doors, no seatbelts, no real bumpers. If you got into a collision, you weren't so much protected as you were politely ejected into the afterlife. Even bicycles offered more passive safety. Visually, the King Midget Model III looked like a scaled-down car drawn by a child. Stubby, high-riding with tiny headlights and a faint resemblance to a shrunken Willys Jeep or Crosley. The Model III, launched in 1957, was supposed to be an improvement over previous versions. It had more cohesive styling, slightly better construction, and a bit more space. But at its core, it was still a microcar built to a price point that made Spartans seem luxurious. The narrow bench seat could technically accommodate 2 people, but only if they were both on very good terms. Driving one was a visceral experience, not in the thrilling sense, but in the sense that you felt every bump, every gust of wind, every hint of incline. You had to plan routes like a sailor watches for storms. Hills were to be avoided. Highways were out of the question. And if you saw a semi-truck in your rearview mirror, you prayed. Still, some people genuinely loved their King Midgets. They appreciated the quirky charm, the simplicity, the go anywhere at 20 miles per hour freedom it offered. Owners formed clubs. Parades were held. Today, a small but proud group of King Midget enthusiasts still keeps these rolling oddities alive. Not because they were good cars, but because they were unique, a living piece of a strange American dream. And maybe that's the best way to think of the 1957 King Midget Model III, not as a failure, but as an incredibly earnest, slightly insane dream. A dream where anyone, even without much money or mechanical know-how, could own and drive a car. It was a symbol of post-war optimism. Even if that optimism struggled to make it up a hill, did you know that it could take over 30 seconds to reach 50 miles per hour? And that's assuming the road was flat, the tires weren't flat, and you hadn't lost your nerve? Even period testers joked about the acceleration figures. But if you were patient, very patient, the King Midget would eventually get there. Maybe. So here's a question for you. Have you ever seen one of these strange little cars in real life? Did someone in your family own one? Or were you one of the brave souls who actually drove one? Share your stories in the comments. We'd love to hear what it was like piloting a miniature tin can through the golden age of chrome and horsepower. Was it comedy, tragedy, or a bit of both? 2. 1951. Crosley Supersport. The 1951 Crosley Supersport was supposed to be a tiny triumph, an American microcar that blended affordability, efficiency, and just enough flair to capture post-war imaginations. Instead, it became something of a punchline. With only 26.5 horsepower under its miniature hood, an engine block made of experimental sheet metal, and a body barely thicker than a refrigerator door, the Supersport was more cute curiosity than serious machine. And while it looked like a shrunken roadster from a distance, up close it felt more like a tin toy come to life. Let's start with the basics. Crosley had built a reputation in the late 1940s for making compact, fuel-efficient vehicles long before gas prices made that trendy. Their designs were clever and resourceful, and in a way, they were ahead of their time, just not built for it. The Supersport was the final evolution of the hotshot, Crosley's attempt at a fun, budget-friendly sports car. And to be fair, it looked the part, at least in photos. Low-slung, open-top, wire wheels, a slightly rakish grille. But as with many things in life, the looks were deceiving. Start the engine, if you could get it to start, and you were greeted with a buzzing sound more appropriate for a mechanical pencil sharpener than a car. The 44 cubic inch, yes, just 44, inline-four engine was technically innovative, being one of the first American production engines with a single overhead camshaft. But that innovation came with a fatal flaw. The block was made from copper-brazed sheet metal, a material that sounded great in theory, but cracked under real-world stress. And once it cracked, the engine was often toast. Mechanics hated working on it, owners hated paying to replace it, and collectors today wince when they hear the words Cobra engine, which Crosley optimistically used as a nickname for it, short for copper brazed. And then there was the body. Calling it lightweight is generous. The Crosley Supersport was practically held together by hopes and rivets. The thin-gauge steel panels had little to no rust-proofing, and even showroom-fresh cars began corroding at the first sign of rain. If you parked one too close to the beach, you could almost hear the oxidation starting. More than a few Supersports began rusting while still on the dealer lot. One owner recalled, it handled like a roller skate and sounded like a sewing machine, which was funny, until you realized both comparisons were entirely accurate. Despite these flaws, there was an undeniable charm to the Supersport. It was tiny, just over 12 feet long, and weighed only 100 pounds. With a top speed of around 65 mph on a good day downhill with a tailwind, it wasn't completely useless, but it certainly wasn't intimidating. On tight, twisty roads, it almost felt nimble, provided you didn't mind the absence of power steering, proper insulation, or much braking power. And if you were looking for a weekend cruiser to take to the local ice cream stand, it had style and uniqueness. You couldn't help but smile looking at it. The problem was driving it often wiped that smile off your face. By 1952, Crosley had ceased automobile production entirely. The company's visionary founder, Powell Crosley Jr., had once dreamed of providing simple transportation for post-war families. But with safety, performance, and quality issues piling up, and a rapidly changing auto market dominated by bigger, stronger Detroit iron, the little Supersport became the last gasp of that dream. Still, a few die-hard fans remain. Some lovingly restore these fragile machines, not because they were great cars, but because they were brave cars. Brave in their ambition, brave in their quirkiness, and brave in their belief that America could build a tiny, affordable roadster in a land of steel and V8s. Fun fact, the Crosley engine block was literally a sheet metal sandwich, copper brazed together, though a space-age experiment in the 1940s that aged about as well as milk in the sun. Even light pressure could lead to cracks. If you overheated it once, you often overheated it forever. So now the real question. Have you ever seen one of these Crosley Super Sports in the wild? Or, even better, has anyone in your family ever owned one? Did it actually drive? Did it survive? Drop a comment and tell us your story. Was it a lovable oddball or a lemon dressed like a roadster? 3. 1958. Edsel Corsair. The 1958 Edsel Corsair wasn't just a flawed automobile. It was the automotive equivalent of a Greek tragedy, complete with ambition, hubris, and a spectacular fall from grace. Born out of Ford Motor Company's desire to dominate every conceivable price point between its existing brands, the Edsel project was a wildly over-engineered solution to a problem that never really existed. And the Corsair, meant to be the higher-end trim of this brand-new marquee, ended up being one of the most infamous failures in American automotive history. Let's start with the hype. Ford spent years teasing the Edsel to the public without even showing the car. Ads described it as the car of the future, promising a revolutionary design that would change everything. Millions were spent. Separate Edsel dealerships were opened. Factory workers were retrained. Marketing teams were told to expect long lines of excited customers. Ford even created a secret code name for the project, E-Car, for experimental. But when the wraps finally came off the 1958 Edsel Corsair, the public reaction was confusion. Styling was supposed to set it apart, and in a way it did. The front grille, a vertical oval that was supposed to evoke a horse collar, ended up being one of the most mocked designs in car history. Some compared it to an Oldsmobile that had been rear-ended by a Lincoln. Others said it looked like a car that was trying to whistle. Worse, once people got past the grille, they realized the rest of the car wasn't much better. Bloated dimensions, excessive chrome, and proportions that looked like a Mercury in a funhouse mirror. And that's being generous. But it wasn't just about how it looked. The 1958 Edsel Corsair was a nightmare under the skin. Mechanically, it was based on existing Ford and Mercury platforms, yet it introduced unnecessary complexity. The Corsair came with a 410 cubic inch MEL V8, one of the largest engines Ford had ever built, paired with the infamous Teletouch automatic transmission. This system used push buttons in the center of the steering wheel hub to shift gears electronically. Sounds advanced, right? Except it rarely worked. The unit was prone to electrical failure, especially in cold or wet conditions. And because it was mounted right where you'd expect the horn to be, drivers sometimes changed gears by accident. Imagine trying to honk at a jaywalker and throwing your car into reverse. Build quality was another Achilles heel. Early Corsairs were riddled with problems. Panels didn't line up. Trim pieces were poorly fastened and rattled loose. The paint was inconsistent. The advanced dashboard was poorly laid out. Some cars left the factory with missing parts. Even the dealers, desperately trying to unload inventory, were sending brand new Edsels back to be reassembled correctly. Then came the pricing problem. Despite being marketed as a mid-price car, the Edsel Corsair was nearly as expensive as a fully loaded Mercury. Consumers were confused. Why pay more for a strange-looking car from a brand they didn't recognize? In 1958, the US was slipping into recession. Buyers wanted value and familiarity. The Edsel offered neither. Sales were a disaster. Instead of the projected 200,000 units per year, Ford sold just over 63,000 Edsels in 1958, including fewer than 10,000 Corsairs. The car became a national joke. Comedians referenced it. Editorials skewered it. Ford executives scrambled to blame someone, anyone, for the failure. The Corsair was quietly discontinued after 1959, and the entire Edsel brand was dead by 1960. Owner quote, one exasperated New Jersey mechanic said, "Even the local junkyard wouldn't take it back. I had one customer trade his Edsel in for a Schwinn and never looked back." Others called it a lemon factory on wheels, and some owners simply parked theirs behind barns and walked away from the embarrassment. And here's the kicker. The Edsel's collapse didn't just hurt Ford's wallet, it damaged the company's image and shook consumer trust. Ford's brass had believed the Edsel would be a major hit, and in doing so, they ignored warning signs from their own market researchers. Internal memos showed concerns about price overlap and design appeal, but leadership charged ahead. Wow. The result? A loss of over 350 million pounds in 1950s dollars, a figure that would amount to over 3 billion today. It remains one of the most catastrophic product launches in history, not just in the auto industry, but across all consumer goods. Did you know? In a final insult to injury, some dealerships tried rebranding unsold Edsels as used Fords to move inventory. And still, they sat on lots like orphan circus wagons. In later years, a few Edsel Corsairs would become collector novelties due to their rarity, but for most, they served as an expensive cautionary tale of what happens when you let marketing run the engineering department. Or 1950, Allstate by Sears, the 1950. Allstate by Sears isn't just a forgotten oddity. It's one of the strangest and most misguided attempts to sell an automobile in American history. Picture this. Post-World War II America, the suburbs are booming, families are buying homes, televisions, refrigerators. And now, thanks to Sears, you could add a car to your shopping list, right between the riding mower and a new set of drapes. Yes, Sears actually sold cars through its catalog. And while the idea sounds novel, maybe even ahead of its time, the execution was a disaster on wheels. The Allstate was essentially a repackaged Henry J, which was already one of the most bare-bones production vehicles ever foisted on the American public. Kaiser Frazer built them. Sears slapped their logo on the hood, added some unique hubcaps and badges, and sold them through a few lucky, or unlucky, department stores. If you thought your local Sears had trouble mounting your tires, imagine trusting them to sell you an entire car. Let's talk specs. Under the hood, or more accurately, under the hopes and dreams of the American consumer, was a 134.2 cubic inch flathead four-cylinder engine producing just 68 horsepower. That's not a typo. The upgraded version came with a 161 cubic inch inline-six that made a whopping 80 hp. Either way, the Allstate accelerated with all the urgency of a chilled sloth. Getting from 0 to 60 took the better part of your lunch break, and climbing steep hills often meant flooring it and praying nobody was behind you. Fuel economy was decent, but it had to be. You'd be on the road a long time just getting across town. Even with its lightweight body, the car was dangerously slow. And forget about passing anyone. The Allstate was the kind of vehicle where you planned your turns and merges like a lunar landing, carefully, precisely, and with plenty of backup plans. And then there were the features, or lack thereof. The Allstate was so stripped down it made a 30s farm truck look luxurious. No power steering, no power brakes, no armrests, no radio, no heater, and, as the cherry on top, no trunk lid. If you wanted to use the trunk, you had to fold down the back seat and crawl in through the cabin like a raccoon looking for a sandwich. It was such an absurd oversight that it became a running joke among car buyers. One owner put it best. It wasn't a car, it was a box of compromises with four wheels. Let's not forget the materials. The thin-gauge metal body panels were barely thicker than a cereal box. Paint flaked off if you looked at it too hard. Rattles developed within days of ownership. And because Sears wasn't exactly equipped with a national network of mechanics or parts distributors, good luck getting anything repaired that didn't involve duct tape and despair. Even the marketing was tone deaf. Sears tried to sell the Allstate as a smart, practical option for the frugal American family. A car you could finance like a washing machine. The slogan might as well have been, "Don't love driving? Then you'll love the Allstate." It was supposed to make car ownership more accessible. Instead, it made it feel like a punishment. Sales numbers? Sears hoped to revolutionize the automotive industry. What they got was around over 1,300 total units sold in just 2 years. Most stores dropped the car quietly, as if pretending it had never happened. And by 1952, the Allstate was gone, not with a bang, but with an embarrassed whisper. Today, finding an Allstate is like spotting a unicorn in a junkyard. A few remain in museums or private collections, mostly owned by automotive masochists or lovers of obscure footnotes in industrial history. They're a curiosity, not a collectible, a conversation piece, a cautionary tale, a testament to the idea that just because you can sell something doesn't mean you should. Owner quote, "It was like a car-shaped punishment for shopping at Sears. I returned everything else. I wish I could have returned that too." Did you ever hear stories from relatives who bought one? Would you even want to drive one today just for the absurdity of it? Or do you think Sears should have stuck to selling Craftsman wrenches instead of entire vehicles? Let's hear your thoughts, especially if you've ever actually seen an Allstate in the wild. 5. 1957 Dodge Custom Royal with torsion air suspension. The 1957 Dodge Custom Royal should have been a triumphant chapter in Chrysler's ambitious, forward-look design era. Bold tail fins, sleek lines, V8 power. But under all that promise was a rolling engineering experiment gone wrong. Advertised with the flair and confidence of a revolution in ride quality, Dodge's new torsion air suspension system promised a glide ride in superior cornering. What buyers got instead was a car that, quite literally, couldn't keep itself together. Let's unpack the technical side first. Torsion Air was Chrysler's name for its new torsion bar front suspension setup, which replaced the more traditional coil springs. In theory, it was brilliant. Torsion bars offered adjustable ride height, reduced unsprung weight, and promised a smoother, more controlled ride. All very progressive ideas for 1957. But theory only gets you so far when the real-world engineering is half-baked. Chrysler rushed this suspension system into production to beat GM and Ford to the punch, and that haste showed. The big issue? Catastrophic reliability. Torsion bars would often sag prematurely, sometimes within the first few hundred miles. Others would seize up or snap altogether, making steering unpredictable, or in worst-case scenarios, locking a front wheel and throwing the car into a spin. At highway speeds, this was more than inconvenient. It was life-threatening. And the ride itself, reviewers and owners noted a bizarre, floaty feel to the Custom Royal. On smooth roads, it cruised like a dream. But the moment you hit a curve, a bump, or an uneven patch, it was as if the car had lost its sense of gravity. The excessive body roll made cornering feel like navigating a canoe through a storm. Combine that with numb steering and soft bias ply tires, and you had a recipe for nausea-inducing instability. That bathtub sensation wasn't just a joke. The Custom Royal was a large car to begin with, a true 50s land yacht, and the soft suspension exaggerated every movement. Pull out of a driveway and the nose dipped. Tap the brakes and the front end dove like a submarine. Take a freeway on-ramp too fast and the whole car leaned over like it was trying to whisper something to the pavement. Passengers often felt seasick before they even left the city limits. Under the hood, it wasn't terrible. The Red Ram and Super Red Ram V8s made decent power, especially for the time. The car had speed, no doubt, it just didn't have the chassis to support it. Owners often described a strange disconnect between engine performance and road behavior. You'd hit the gas and the car would surge forward confidently, but the suspension couldn't translate that momentum into control. And it wasn't just the suspension. These cars suffered from poor build quality overall, largely due to Chrysler's decision to rush the entire 1957 lineup to market. Spotty welds, inconsistent panel alignment, water leaks, and electrical gremlins were all common. The bodies were notorious for rusting prematurely, sometimes within the first year, especially in northern climates. Mechanically and structurally, they were built like dreams. Nightmares, that is. Owner quote, "It drove beautifully for the first 300 miles. Then it started groaning, leaning, and lurching. At one point, I swore it was dancing." If you were lucky, you had a dealer who knew how to retrofit or adjust the suspension. If not, you were stuck with a giant, unpredictable lounge chair on wheels. The Custom Royal was the kind of car that looked stunning in a showroom, especially with its chrome tail fins and bold color schemes. But the moment you lived with it, the glamour peeled off like its trim. The ultimate irony? Torsion bar suspension would later become a reliable standard in Mopars for decades, after Chrysler finally worked out the kinks. But in 1957, the Dodge Custom Royal was the sacrificial lamb. Beautiful, ambitious, and dangerously flawed. Did anyone in your family ever own one of these? Or maybe you saw one at a car show, still wearing its original fins and scars. Would you dare to drive one today? Or is this a case of, look, don't touch? Let's hear your stories. Say. 1950, Davis Divan. The 1950 Davis Divan is perhaps one of the most bizarre and infamous failures in American automotive history, not just because of its strange three-wheel design, but because the entire company behind it was built on a foundation of hype, fraud, and shattered promises. On the surface, the Divan seemed like an optimistic vision of the future. Sleek, space-age styling, lightweight construction, four-wide seating, and aircraft-inspired controls. But dig just a little deeper, and you'd find a deeply flawed machine sold by a smooth-talking dreamer who left behind a trail of disappointed customers, unpaid employees, and investors who never saw a return on their money. Let's start with the cringe design. The Divan had only 3 wheels, 2 in the back and 1 in the front for steering. That layout might seem familiar to motorcycle enthusiasts, but when applied to a car-sized vehicle, it created catastrophic handling issues. While a car with 1 rear wheel, like the Morgan three-wheeler, could still maintain balance under acceleration, the Davis had a single front wheel that was responsible for all steering input. This made the car incredibly unstable in corners. Imagine trying to guide a bar stool downhill with one hand. That's what the Divan felt like at anything above 20 miles per hour. Turning sharply could cause the entire car to lift off on one side. It was like a rolling physics experiment gone wrong. Inside, the Davis was unusual in a way only a car from a scam-riddled company could be. The cabin featured 4 across seating on a single bench, which sounds good in theory, but was wildly impractical. For one, the driver sat slightly off-center. There was no real dashboard, just a handful of scattered instruments, and almost no attention to comfort or safety. There were no seat belts, no crumple zones, no meaningful suspension to speak of. It felt like a car designed by someone who had only heard of cars, not someone who had actually built or driven one. Even the windshield wipers were operated by hand. As for performance, it was laughable. The Davis Divan used a Hercules 2.10 flat-4 engine, originally designed for use in forklifts, which put out a meager 40 horsepower. In a lightweight car, that could have been enough. But when paired with the Davis's clumsy 3-wheel setup and uneven weight distribution, the result was sluggish acceleration, wobbly cornering, and constant fear. It topped out at around 60 miles per hour if the wind was at your back and you had enough road. But it wasn't the kind of car anyone wanted to push to its limits. But the biggest failure wasn't mechanical, it was moral. The car's creator, Gary Davis, was a charismatic pitchman with a flair for the dramatic. He claimed the Divan would revolutionize transportation. He held flashy press events in Los Angeles, took out big ads, and showed off prototype models to the press. He even promised a production rate of 50 cars per day, a number that might have sounded plausible in Detroit, but was laughable from a startup company with 1 shop and fewer than a dozen employees. Investors were dazzled by Davis's confidence and the futuristic styling of the Divan. Some even handed over life savings. But behind the scenes, the company was a disaster. Davis spent much of the investment money on personal luxuries, mismanaged the assembly line, and failed to pay suppliers or workers. The California courts eventually caught up to him, and he was now convicted of grand theft and fraud. The Davis Motor Car Company collapsed almost overnight. Only 13 cars were ever built. Of those, very few survived. Today, the Davis Divan is a museum curiosity, a quirky relic from an era when America's post-war optimism made people believe anything was possible, even if it wasn't. It's now remembered not just as a failure of engineering, but a cautionary tale about trusting charisma over substance. Owner quote, "It felt like it might tip over just from looking at it wrong." Think about that for a moment. A car so poorly designed, so unstable, that just standing near it inspired fear. Yet people bought into the dream because the promise was shiny enough. Now I'm curious, would you ever want to sit behind the wheel of a Davis Divan just to feel the fear for yourself? What would it take for you to trust a three-wheeled car again? And do you think today's car industry still has Gary Davises hiding in plain sight? Let's open it up. Leave a comment below. Would you drive one or just take a picture and run? 7. 1955 Hudson Jet. The 1955 Hudson Jet stands as one of the clearest examples of a company collapsing under the weight of its own bad decisions. In a post-war era when car makers were thriving on bold designs, V8 power, and chrome-laden excess, Hudson made a last-ditch pivot into the compact car market, but did so with all the grace of a brick through a showroom at a window. The Jet wasn't just a failure because it was small or slow. It failed because it was fundamentally confused about what it was supposed to be. And worse, it dragged down an iconic nameplate with it. To understand the Jet, you have to understand the Poisson context. Hudson had made a name for itself in the 1940s and early 50s with sleek, low-slung sedans and NASCAR-dominating step-down models like the Hornet. These were innovative, performance-forward cars that punched above their weight and built a loyal following. But by 1953, Hudson was losing ground fast. Competitors had caught up. The company's engineering was still sharp, but its designs were aging, and it didn't have the cash to retool its full-size cars. So, someone at Hudson decided they could survive by building a compact Buick. It was meant to be cheaper, lighter, and modern, a direct shot at the emerging low-cost market that Nash and others were beginning to explore. The idea wasn't inherently bad. What was bad was the execution. The Jet was designed under the heavy hand of Hudson president A.E. Burritt, who insisted the car look like a scaled-down full-size Hudson rather than a clean slate compact. He wanted high seating positions, thick roof pillars, and upright styling that was already considered dowdy even before the car launched. The result was a stubby, boxy, deeply awkward car that had all the aerodynamic appeal of a school locker. It looked old in 1953. By 1955, it looked ancient. Under the hood, the Jet carried a 202 cubic inch inline-six, which was actually quite advanced in some ways. The engine had respectable durability, and some versions even had twin-carb setups. Hudson called them twin-H power, but at best, you were working with about 120 horsepower in a 2,600-pound car. Even with overdrive, the car was sluggish. And with those tall, narrow proportions and upright stance, handling wasn't exactly spirited. It didn't help that the Jet had no V8 option, a kiss of death in a marketplace that was rapidly moving toward bigger power plants and flashier performance. Inside, the Jet wasn't much better. Materials were decent by compact standards, but the cabin was narrow, legroom was tight, and visibility was poor thanks to those chunky pillars. Build quality was okay, but not exceptional. It was neither cheap enough to compete with Ford's entry-level models, nor stylish enough to lure people away from more progressive rivals like the Rambler or VW Beetle. In short, it satisfied no one, and it was expensive to develop. The Jet program burned through a huge chunk of Hudson's remaining capital. Some sources estimate over $10 million, a massive amount for the time. With only around 21,000 sold across its short two-year run, 1953-54, the Jet didn't come close to making back what it attempted. Worse, it diverted resources from Hudson's core full-size lineup, which desperately needed modernization. By 1954, Hudson was bleeding out. They were forced into a merger with Nash, creating the American Motors Corporation. One of the first casualties of that union? The Jet. It was unceremoniously axed, and Hudson's brand identity never recovered. The once mighty Hornet faded away, and by 1957, the Hudson name itself was gone from the market. Owner quote, "The Jet had no wings, no speed, and no future." That line cuts right to the truth. It promised thrift, but delivered disappointment. It wore a name steeped in speed and innovation, but was incapable of either. Industry result. The Jet didn't just flop, it helped kill Hudson. It was a case study in what happens when a car company tries to follow trends without understanding them and lets ego override market research. Imagine the parallel today. What if a luxury performance brand like BMW suddenly released a budget car built from recycled plastic with 3 cylinders and rubber bumpers, just to compete with a Hyundai? That's what the Jet was. A great company building the wrong car for the wrong people at the wrong time. If you ever see one at a show, and that's rare, don't laugh too hard, but do take a moment to appreciate just how fragile even a strong brand can be when vision and reality part ways. Would you ever want to drive a Hudson Jet just to experience the mistake firsthand? Or would you rather watch it from the safe distance of a museum rope line? 8. 1958 Renault Dauphine. The 1958 Renault Dauphine, when brought to American shores, was a rolling contradiction, marketed as a sophisticated European alternative to Detroit's land yachts, yet plagued with every kind of flaw that could make a car unlivable in American conditions. While it had a charming name and looked like something that belonged in a Parisian postcard, the Dauphine quickly became infamous on U.S. roads, for all the wrong reasons. In theory, the Dauphine should have been a clever import. Post-war Americans were beginning to flirt with the idea of small, fuel-efficient cars. Volkswagen's Beetle had proven that a foreign compact could succeed, especially with young drivers and economy-minded buyers. Renault, France's largest automaker at the time, saw a ripe opportunity. They exported the Dauphine in droves. In fact, over 200,000 were sold in the US in just a few years. But the success was short-lived, because as soon as Americans drove the Dauphine, the illusion cracked. Start with the power, or lack of it. The US version of the Dauphine was saddled with a rear-mounted, water-cooled 845cc inline-4 engine, making a miserable 32 horsepower. That's less power than many riding lawnmowers have today. Even in the lightweight Dauphine, about 1,500 pounds, acceleration was glacial. 0 to 60 mph took over on 30 seconds, assuming you ever reached 60. Climbing hills was an exercise in patience and prayer. The car's tiny drum brakes were wholly inadequate, especially on American highways where even the most leisurely Buick could stop better. Combine that with one skinny 135mm tires and an ultralight front end thanks to the rear engine layout, and you had a recipe for disaster in emergency situations. The handling was twitchy, prone to oversteer, and unpredictable at best. One contemporary tester famously wrote that the Dauphine handled like a unicycle on ice. Then came the reliability issues. The Dauphine was not built for the American climate. In humid or wet areas, it rusted, like it was trying to win a contest. The sheet metal was thin, poorly protected, and even modest road salt turned it into lace. Worse, the cooling system was marginal, and in hot states like Texas or Arizona, overheating was practically guaranteed. Owners frequently found themselves pulled over on the shoulder, hood popped, steam hissing out while traffic whizzed past. The Dauphine wasn't just slow, it was fragile. Even worse was the build quality. Electrical issues were constant, gearboxes were finicky, and the clutch cables often stretched or broke. The paint flaked off, the window seals leaked, entire sections of trim would detach. And if you dared to drive it in snow, the combination of rear weight bias and no real traction control meant it behaved more like a sled than a car. To American buyers used to bulletproof Chevys and Fords, the Dauphine felt alien. Not in a good way. It didn't help that mechanics often had no idea how to service them, and parts were hard to source. What began as a novelty quickly turned into a burden. By the early 1960s, most Dauphines were already disappearing from the roads, their rusted shells littering junkyards across the country. Owner quote, "It handled like a unicycle on ice." That's no exaggeration. It may have looked cheerful, but the moment conditions turned tricky, the Dauphine was all over the road like a terrified squirrel. Critics noticed too. The car made multiple worst cars of all time lists from outlets like Car and Driver, Time Magazine, and Automobile. Many rated it below the Yugo, which is saying something. In retrospect, the Dauphine was a cultural misfit. It made sense in Europe, where city streets were narrow, fuel was expensive, and top speed wasn't a concern. But it, completely failed to meet the needs or expectations of American drivers, especially in the wide-open spaces of the Midwest or the harsh climates of the Northeast. Yet somehow, despite its flaws, the Dauphine remains a fascinating chapter in car history. It was part of the first wave of imports to seriously challenge the U.S. market, and its failure taught crucial lessons to those that followed. Would you dare drive a Dauphine today, just to feel what a true disaster behind the wheel felt like? Or would you keep it under a tarp, safe and silent, a cautionary tale on four wheels? 9. 1959 Buick LeSabre. The 1959 Buick LeSabre is a prime example of automotive excess gone wrong. At a glance, it was a rolling spectacle of 1950s design. Wild tail fins, a long sweeping body, and an abundance of chrome that could blind a person if the sun hit it just right. Buick's intention was clear. They wanted to create a statement car, a symbol of post-war optimism in American luxury. But underneath all the chrome and flashy styling, the LeSabre was a heavy, sluggish mess that did little to live up to the high expectations its appearance promised. The LeSabre was equipped with Buick's famous Dynaflow transmission, a torque converter-based system that had been a staple of Buick's lineup for years. While smooth in operation, the Dynaflow transmission was notorious for sapping the car's performance potential. The V8 engine, despite its solid displacement, felt neutered by the overly soft transmission. When you floored the accelerator, the car didn't leap forward. Instead, it lazily groaned as if it was reluctantly being coaxed into motion. Owner quote, "You floored it, and the car just sighed." This line is so apt because it captures the essence of the LeSabre's driving experience. You could tell that there was potential lurking somewhere deep in the engine, but the transmission just wouldn't let it shine. Rather than being propelled forward with excitement, the car seemed to drag itself along at a lethargic pace. You didn't feel like you were driving a luxury car. Instead, you felt like you were floating in slow motion. While its performance left much to be desired, the styling of the LeSabre was the polar opposite. A bold, attention-grabbing effort that screamed, "Look at me!" The towering tail fins that seemed to be designed by someone who had just watched too many sci-fi movies were a defining feature of the car's design. The chrome, while glamorous at first glance, became a curse when you realized just how much weight it added. Nearly 200 pounds of chrome trim adorned the LeSabre, a ridiculous amount of decoration that only served to drag down the car's overall performance. Driving the LeSabre was like steering a battleship. It was big, it was flashy, and it commanded attention. But that attention didn't translate into any thrilling driving experience. The car's handling was more like floating along than taking a corner. The weight of the chrome, combined with the soft suspension, created a very loose, undemanding drive, offering little in terms of feedback or road connection. To add to the cringe factor, the interior, while luxurious, was not particularly practical. The seats were large and plush, designed for comfort, but that came at the expense of any real support, making long drives feel more like lounging than driving. The drivability of the car was a serious issue. It was slow, cumbersome, and felt more like a status symbol than a real performance machine. What the LeSabre ultimately represented was a grandiose vision of a car that looked exciting on paper, but failed to deliver in any meaningful way. It was the epitome of automotive excess, with designers seemingly more concerned with making the car look good than actually making it functional or fun to drive. Despite the sleek lines and the impressive chrome trim, it ended up being an underwhelming experience for anyone behind the wheel. The irony is that the LeSabre's design looked fast, but in reality it moved like molasses. It was one of those cars that drew attention, but for all the wrong reasons. Even the people who owned them would often wonder why they bothered in the first place. In hindsight, it was a wide, grand design that failed to translate into anything practical or enjoyable. Bonus cringe. All that chrome made for a striking car, but also a car that wound weighed down on the experience. adding weight without adding any tangible performance benefit. That heavy, chrome-laden body might have looked regal, but it made the LeSabre feel like it was driving through treacle. So the LeSabre became a lesson in false appearances. It was all about show and no-go. Sure, it made a statement when parked in front of your home or driving through the neighborhood, but behind the wheel it was a different story entirely. A car that looked fast, but drove with all the urgency of a sigh. 10. 1953 Kaiser Dragon. The 1953 Kaiser Dragon was less a car and more a strange automotive fever dream. A last-ditch gamble by an independent automaker trying desperately to stand out in a post-war market increasingly dominated by the Big Three. By the early 1950s, Kaiser Motors was fighting for relevance and survival, and the Dragon was their idea of a luxury flagship. The result? A plush, overdone barge with an exotic name, a soggy vinyl roof, and all the performance of a deflating air mattress. Let's start with the name. Dragon. It sounded menacing, mystical, like something that would breathe fire and devour Cadillacs in its path. But behind the bold script and fancy marketing was a car that could barely outrun a milk truck. The Dragon was based on the aging Kaiser Manhattan platform, stretched and dressed up to the nines with every bolt-on Kaiser could muster. It came standard with a gold-plated ignition key, chrome-laden exterior trim, and interior appointments Kaiser described as world-class luxury. But for all its gilded touches, the Dragon was hiding a very underwhelming heart. Under the hood was a tired, 226 cubic inch flathead inline six, making just a 118 horsepower. It was mated to a Hydra-matic automatic transmission, which helped smooth the ride but sucked what little life the engine had right out of it. Floor the throttle and you didn't surge forward. You waited and waited. The Dragon's 0 to 60 time was well over 15 seconds, which wouldn't have been so bad if it hadn't weighed almost 3,700 pounds. Loaded. It was sluggish even by early 50s standards. More than one contemporary review joked that the car could be passed by pedestrians if they were sufficiently motivated. One owner recalled, "It couldn't outrun a delivery van." And they weren't exaggerating. In an era where V8s were starting to dominate, the Dragon's wheezy six felt like it had wandered in from the previous decade. But the real claim to fame, or infamy, was the Dragon's over-the-top interior and trim. The bois bamboo vinyl upholstery was supposed to evoke exotic Asian luxury. What it actually resembled was a tiki bar exploded in the back seat. The padded vinyl top, meanwhile, was intended to give the car an upscale look. But in practice, it soaked up water like a sponge. Park a Dragon outside during a thunderstorm, and you weren't just dealing with water spots, you were dealing with a full-on mildew assault. The car's roof held moisture for days, and many owners complained that it smelled like a swamp and trod by the end of the week. One particularly vivid owner put it like this: "It smelled like a wet D after every thunderstorm." The Dragon's attempts at safety and comfort were ahead of their time. Padded dashboards, extra soundproofing, thick upholstery, but they came at the expense of weight, price, and performance. It was a classic case of trying to do too much with too little. The car looked big, sounded fancy, and carried a sticker price that competed with mid-level Cadillacs and Lincolns. But it didn't have the performance, engineering, or brand cachet to back it up. The exterior was no less polarizing. The Dragon's front grille looked like a gaping fish mouth. Its proportions were awkward, and the rear fenders had bulges that seemed copied from 3 other cars simultaneously. The chrome trim, and there was plenty of it, was said to add over 200 pounds to the car's weight. It was, as one critic put it, a car built by a committee that had never agreed on anything. And then there was the marketing. Kaiser pitched the Dragon as a sophisticated, limited production luxury car for refined buyers. The advertisements featured gold leaf lettering and exotic imagery, dragons, silk, palm trees, while the product itself drove like a wet couch. There was a jarring disconnect between what the Dragon pretended to be and what it actually was. Consumers noticed, and they didn't buy. In the end, fewer than 1,300 Dragons were built, and they marked the final nail in the coffin for Kaiser's passenger car operations. The Dragon wasn't just a commercial failure, it was the end of the road. By the following year, Kaiser had abandoned domestic car production and moved its focus to military vehicles and South American operations. The Dragon, despite all the hoopla, went out with a whimper. Today, the 1953 Kaiser Dragon exists mostly as a rolling cautionary tale, a reminder that flash can't hide flaws, that style without substance is a one-way ticket to ridicule, and that even gold-plated keys can't start a revolution if they're attached to a car that can't keep water out of its roof. Collectors may value the Dragon now for its rarity and sheer oddness, but no one mistakes it for a great car. It remains one of the strangest blends of opulence, desperation, and mediocrity ever to wear a chrome badge. And that name, Dragon, lingers in irony. 1954. Willys Aero, the 1954. Willys Aero is perhaps one of the most tragically forgettable footnotes in American automotive history, not because it was a catastrophic failure like the Edsel or dangerously unstable like the Davis Divan, but because it represented everything that could go wrong when a company tries to compete in the wrong league with the wrong tools at the wrong time. It was, in every sense, a car that aimed squarely for mediocrity and still somehow missed. Willys Overland had built a well-earned reputation during World War II as the maker of the indestructible military Jeep. Their name was synonymous with rugged dependability, a badge of honor forged in the mud and blood of global conflict. But by the early 1950s, with peacetime prosperity booming and suburbia on the rise, Willys wanted a piece of the civilian automobile market. Unfortunately, they went about it with all the flair of a soggy saltine. Enter the Willys Aero. Originally launched in 1952, by 1954, it had already been facelifted into irrelevance. Willys marketed it as an affordable, compact alternative to the growing tide of flashy full-size sedans. And while there's something admirable about restraint and practicality, the Aero pushed that philosophy to near invisibility. Its appearance was so utterly anonymous that even contemporary reviewers struggled to describe it beyond clean or plain. With its awkward proportions, stubby nose, and boxy profile, it looked less like a car and more like a government-issued appliance. And things didn't improve once you got behind the wheel. The 1954 Aero came with a choice of aging six-cylinder engines, ranging from a flathead to the more powerful but still modest F-head Hurricane engine, which made somewhere around 90 horsepower on its best day. To say it lacked excitement would be generous. Acceleration was glacial, even by 1950s standards. Pressing the gas pedal felt more like submitting a polite request than issuing a command. The car eventually complied, but never enthusiastically. 0 to 60? Maybe. If you had a long enough runway and no particular urgency. The Aero's body was relatively light, which helped a little, but it also meant that the ride was choppy and the handling uncertain. On rough roads, the car bounced and rattled with a kind of nervous energy, as if it were unsure of its own structural integrity. The steering was slow and vague, and the drum brakes required both faith and forethought to be used safely. As for cornering, well, let's just say you didn't. You made wide suggestions and hoped the car interpreted them correctly. Inside, the story was equally bleak. The cabin was as Spartan as a naval barracks. Materials were basic to the point of being industrial. Thin plastics, plain steel, and vinyl that felt like it might dissolve in the rain. The dashboard was minimalist, not by design but by necessity. There simply wasn't much to display. No power features, no chrome trim, no frills of any kind, just the bare minimum, and often not even that. Former owners recall that the car felt unfinished, as if someone had walked off the assembly line halfway through the build. The Aero wasn't just slow and bland, it was also misaligned with the times. America in 1954 was embracing speed, style, and sophistication. Chevy had the Bel Air, Ford was preparing the Thunderbird, and even Plymouth had V8 options and sleek new bodies. The Willys Aero, by contrast, felt like something built in the corner of a warehouse using leftover parts from a surplus truck. To make matters worse, Willys had no real dealer network or advertising push behind the car. They lacked the marketing muscle to make people want something that already looked like it belonged in a rental fleet for a rural DMV. And when it came time to trade in or repair it, good luck. Parts availability was limited, and mechanics weren't thrilled to work on a brand already teetering on the edge of extinction. One former owner recalled it bitterly. It wasn't bad enough to remember, or good enough to keep. It just existed. The end came quickly. In 1955, just 1 year after this final iteration of the Aero, Willys stopped U.S. passenger car production altogether. The Aero was quietly discontinued, never to return on American soil. Most Americans didn't notice. The car simply disappeared into the fog of forgotten nameplates. Ironically, the Aero found a second life in Brazil, where it was produced under license well into the 1960s. In that context, its simplicity and durability made it marginally more successful. But in the US, the Willys Aero is a ghost, a car so devoid of presence that spotting one today feels almost surreal, like discovering a vintage washing machine with a license plate. So why does it matter? Because the 1954 Willys Aero serves as a cautionary tale. It wasn't a laughingstock, a fire hazard, or a scam. It was just boring. And in a market that rewards innovation, emotion, 1957, Mercury Turnpike Cruiser. The 1957 Mercury Turnpike Cruiser is one of those cars that tried so hard to be the future that it ended up as a cautionary tale from the past. Conceived during Detroit's most extravagant and wildly experimental years, it was a machine born from the fever dream of tail fins, chrome, and a post-war America utterly convinced that jet-age design was the answer to every question, even the ones no one was asking. Unfortunately, the Turnpike Cruiser ended up answering all the wrong ones. Meant to be Mercury's technological flagship, the Turnpike Cruiser was more than just a car. It was a rolling billboard for everything the late 1950s thought was futuristic. Regardless of whether it worked, made sense, or had any bearing on real-world driving, it came festooned with every gimmick and gadget the engineers could cram into its elongated body. Roof-mounted air intakes dubbed breezeway vents were supposed to help with cabin airflow. In practice, they were mostly ineffective and occasionally leaked water like sieves. There was also a rear window that retracted down into the body, an idea that looked great on paper, until you realized it turned the interior into a wind tunnel or a rain trap depending on the weather. Then there were the gadgets. Oh, the gadgets. An electric seat memory system, a push-button transmission, power everything, all fine in theory, but this was 1957, and American electronics weren't exactly NASA grade. Owners quickly discovered that many of the Turnpike Cruiser's futuristic systems were either non-functional out of the box or stopped working after the first few months. One exasperated owner summed it up perfectly. Half the gadgets never worked, and the other half didn't help. And beneath all the gimmickry, a massive, overweight beast with mediocre mechanicals. The car's enormous body and endless chrome trim made it feel like you were captaining a small freighter down suburban roads. It was built on a heavy frame, burdened by complexity, and powered by a big block V8 that made decent horsepower, but struggled to overcome the sheer heft of the vehicle. It wasn't fast, it wasn't nimble. It was, in many ways, the automotive equivalent of dragging a jukebox through molasses. The driving experience was predictably poor. Steering was vague, body roll was pronounced, and braking required both time and space. The suspension was designed for straight-line highway cruising, hence the name, but anything resembling a corner or rough surface exposed its weaknesses immediately. Worse still, quality control was spotty. Many Turnpike Cruisers left the factory with misaligned panels, rattling trim, or systems that didn't function as advertised. Styling, of course, was a matter of taste. And even in the 1950s, a decade known for wild design, the Turnpike Cruiser's look was controversial. The front grille looked like a Baroque cheese grater crossed with an industrial fan intake. The rear fins and trim lines tried to blend spaceship aesthetics with luxury cues and ended up as a visual cacophony. With an interior dominated by bizarre angles, domed instrumentation, and airplane-like levers, the cockpit felt like a film set from a low-budget sci-fi movie. Mercury billed it as futuristic, The public quickly labeled it weird. But perhaps the most damning fact is how quickly the Turnpike Cruiser became the butt of jokes, even among car people. Sales were underwhelming, and Mercury realized almost immediately that their rocket-powered ambitions had overshot the runway. The car was quickly downgraded and phased out within a couple of years, with the Turnpike Cruiser name quietly shelved. Nobody missed it. Nobody asked for a sequel. In the long run, the 1957 Mercury Turnpike Cruiser stands not just as an oddball relic of the overstyled, overpromised 50s, but as an object lesson in design excess. It's what happens when a car is created by a boardroom chasing headlines rather than drivers seeking a good experience. Its failure wasn't due to one fatal flaw, but a whole stack of them, layered like chrome trim on a tail fin. So while it might get a chuckle at a classic car show today, make no mistake, back then it was mostly a rolling punchline. All flash, no substance, and too clever by half. The Turnpike Cruiser tried to drive us into the future and ended up stalling in the parking lot of history.